Hello everyone and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Paul Bergham and I've been asked to cover the introduction for today's session by David Rosser, who's currently on holiday. David is a partner account manager with Microsoft and manages Microsoft's relationship with Ingram Micro. On behalf of Ingram Micro and Microsoft, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Today's Licensing Live webinar is the final webinar in our current series, which we have run exclusively with Ingram Micro, and is ideal if you are new to licensing, looking for a licensing refresher, or just want to get up to date without having to impact too much of your working week. To help you reference and remember what we've covered today, each webinar is supported with a 2-page PDF, and every session is recorded, so you have the option to go through it again or perhaps share with a colleague to help their licensing learning journey. Plus, if you want to constantly feed your licensing knowledge, we'd encourage you to sign up to the Licensing School blog. This and all the detail I mentioned will be sent out to all our Licensing Live webinar attendees via a handy email, and this will be sent out on the Monday after each webinar. Now, on to today's session. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Rich Gibbons. Rich is a member of the Licensing School team based out of the UK and has over 10 years sales and licensing training experience in the channel. Plus, is part of the team responsible for Microsoft's Get Licensing Ready training portal, which has helped thousands of partners understand Microsoft's licensing across the world. Before we begin, I just want to finish on a few housekeeping points for today. We've placed all attendees on mute except for our presenters. If any of you have dialed in from a mobile, I would ask that you check your mobile phone is on mute throughout the session. If you'd like to ask a question along the way, please type these into the console, and we will do our best to answer what we can and stick to the allotted time. Without further ado, let's hand over to Rich to take us through today's session. Rich, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me again today. So as you can see, today we're going to be doing SQL Server 2016, the perfect thing to take us all into the holiday season. Everyone loves SQL Server licensing, and you will love it even more after today's session. As always, this is a training session rather than a presentation, so any questions that you've got, put them in the Skype window and we will do our best to get them answered during the session. If we can, for interest of time or whatever it may be, we'll work with Ingram to try and get those answered for you after the session as well. So, without further ado, let's get started with looking at SQL Server 2016 and its licensing. So the agenda is going to be the basics of licensing, so the things that kind of almost everyone needs to know and will come up on a very regular basis. Then we'll look at licensing in a virtual environment, which I think you'll agree is also quite common these days. Then we'll look at something known as license mobility, and finally some further licensing principles. So, for the basics, let us first look at the additions that are available with SQL Server 2016. First of all, we've got what we would call our principal additions. So these are the main ones. We've got Standard, which is your basic database reporting and analytic features. We've also got Enterprise, which, as the name suggests, is aimed at typically larger organizations, has more features and more things around business intelligence, things like data warehousing. So Standard, more entry level, Enterprise, that next level up. We've also got what we would call our specialized editions. We've got SQL Server Web, which, as the name suggests, is aimed at databases on websites, so public databases. And we've also got Parallel Data Warehouse. So again, this is the second time we've mentioned Data Warehouse already. For those of you not familiar, Data Warehouse it's a relatively self-descriptive name. Having a SQL Data Warehouse is having a huge collection of different data stored in different ways to be pulled on and used at different times, just as you would imagine Amazon's warehouse, for example. Think of that, but with your corporate data. Parallel Data Warehouse, a specialized edition of SQL aimed at very much that type of scenario. And then our breadth editions. We've got SQL Server Developer. Again, that SQL's got quite good descriptive naming conventions. SQL Server Developer is for developers to do development things with. So you can't use SQL Developer in a production environment. You can't run your business on it, but you would have your dev guys in the background using this edition, testing your line of business applications to make sure it works with SQL 2016. And then SQL Server Express. So this is an entry-level edition. It's quite limited, small database, can only use a certain amount of hardware and RAM, but it can be used in production. So if you've got someone looking for a very small SQL requirement, Express could fit the bill. It could be that people would use that just to learn SQL before they jump into purchasing the web edition or standard edition, something like that. Those of you that are familiar with SQL Server 2014 will notice that there's an edition missing. So SQL Server 2014 used to have a Business Intelligence edition. With 2016, that has been removed, and the principal editions are simply Standard and Enterprise. So now we know what editions there are. Let's briefly look at what licensing models are available for them. So for Standard, we can license through the Server and Cal model or through the core licensing model. And we'll look at how these work in a little bit more depth in a couple of slides. So Standard, we've got a choice, Server and Cal or core. For SQL Server Enterprise, it's just core. So Server and Cal or core for Standard, just core for Enterprise. With Web, again, core licensing, but we'll notice here that Web only available through SPLA. So that's the service provider licensing agreement. So any customers who really need the Web edition, you're going to need to look at whether SPLA works in their environment. If so, brilliant. If not, you need to look at a different edition. Parallel Data Warehouse, per core licensing again. And then we'll see for Developer and for Express, these are both free. So Developer used to have a nominal charge. Earlier this year, it was changed to be free for anyone who is a member of the Microsoft Dev Essentials program. And that program is in itself free to join. So if you're talking to customers about development, encourage them to get their devs to sign up to the Dev Essentials program, and they'll be able to get access to SQL Server Developer free of charge. SQL Express, again, free of charge. You can download that from the Microsoft site. So if you and or your customers are interested in playing around with SQL, you can go and grab that straight away. So that's an overview there of the editions that are available and how one would go about licensing them. So now to look at those licensing models in a little bit more depth. First of all, we'll look at the Server Cal model, and we'll see that applies, as we said, to the Standard edition. So what are the rules? Licensing, pretty much all about rules, so let's take a look. We'll see here, SQL Server 2016 CALs can be used against any SQL Server. So, if you've got previous editions, different previous editions and versions of SQL, you can use these CALs. And the CALs are available, as you will expect, as user CALs or device CALs, so you can choose which one makes more sense, for your customer's organization. And this is quite an important point. They're required even for indirect access to SQL Server. So this is absolutely something to consider when you're speccing up a SQL licensing scenario and you're talking to customers. And what this means is, imagine you've got 150 users and they all access 3 CRM servers, and then those servers access SQL. Some people may look at that and say, there's only 3 servers that are actually talking to the SQL Server. Thus, we only need 3 CALs. But this requirement for indirect access means that because those users are accessing something which accesses SQL, all those 150 users need to be licensed with a SQL Server CAL. And there's no limit to how many layers there can be between the user and the SQL Server. So when you're working out the licensing, always need to take into account ultimately how many people will be accessing SQL indirectly. It's also known as multiplexing. So if you see that in a data sheet or a Microsoft exam or a customer mentions it, multiplexing is this indirect access. And CALs are available for external users. So again, if your customer has got a business partner or a third party that will be accessing their SQL Server, and they're licensed through Server CAL model, they will be able to purchase the CALs for these external users just as for their internals. So Server CAL, nothing particularly different from other products that use that, but really do bear in mind about that indirect access piece. The other option that we've got is core licensing. Applies to standard and enterprise, because now we're looking just at these principal editions. So we saw Server and CAL just for standard, core, standard or enterprise. And what are the rules with core licensing? So you count the number of cores in the server. It's a good place to start, to be honest. Count the number of cores, and then you buy that number of core licenses. There is, however, a requirement for a minimum of 4 core licenses per processor. So if your customer says, I've got a server, it's got 1 processor with 2 cores, they would still need to buy 4 core licenses for that processor. And because it's a minimum per processor, if they had 2 processors, each with 2 cores, they would need to buy a total of 8 core licenses. It's a minimum of 4 for the first processor and a minimum of 4 for the second processor too. So when you're working out how many core licenses are required, always remember there's that minimum of 4. Also remember that core licenses are sold in packs of 2. So this is something that can catch people out sometimes. You're working with the customer, right? You've got this many processors, this many cores. You need 20 core licenses. But what you would quote them is 10 packs of 2. So sometimes there can be conversations, where people are kind of crossing wires somewhat. Customer says, right, I want to buy 20 licenses. Double check, do they mean 20 packs of 2 or do they mean 10 packs of 2? So always want to bear in mind that when you're talking with a customer, you're both talking about the same unit of measurement, really. And then when you license SQL with core licensing, you don't require CALs as well. So we saw, in a previous session that with Windows Server 2016, that licensing is based on cores, and Windows Server also requires CAL licensing. SQL Server is slightly different. You license the cores, and there's no requirement for additional CALs. So now that we've looked at that first section, that brings us to the ever popular true or false questions. So as always, things at the ready, answers in the Skype window just to see how we're getting on. So first of all, SQL Server CAL licensing is available. So I don't even need to finish talking. Fantastic. That's correct. No, it's not. We saw it's just for the standard edition. Next, there's a minimum of 4 core licenses per CPU. Absolutely, yep. Everyone's straight in there. Brilliant. That is correct. And then number 3, core licensing available for all the editions. Everyone straight in there. Yes, it is. Marvellous. That's a very, very good start. Thank you very much. So now we're going to move into licensing in the virtual environments. So this is something which will come up time and time again, and can have something of a bad reputation. People think, SQL licensing, virtual environments, this is going to be difficult. So this is really just to show you the core principles, and that actually it's not that bad. Once you know the rules, it makes a lot of sense. So first, let's look at server cal licensing. Here, customers got their server. They've got 4 virtual machines, and 2 of those virtual machines are running SQL Server. How would we license this? We would buy 2 SQL Server licenses, 1 for each of the virtual machines. The rule being, you license the individual virtual machines. So from a licensing perspective, that is no different than if they were physical servers. Now, if you've got 2 physical servers, you would buy 2 server licenses. 2 virtual servers, you buy 2 server licenses. So under server cal, just the same whether they're physical or virtual. No need to concern yourself too much there. With core licensing, same customer, they've got 4 virtual machines, 2 of them are running SQL Server. What do we do now when it comes to core licensing? We look at the number of virtual cores that are being used by those VMs. Here we can see each virtual machine is using 2 virtual cores, or slightly confusingly, you can also call them virtual processors. So in this scenario, virtual cores, virtual processors can be used interchangeably. So we see they're using 2, so we would buy 4 core licenses. The rule being, you license the virtual processors being used by the virtual machines with a minimum of 4 core licenses per VM. So again, very, very similar to how it works with physical servers. What really what you need to see here is it doesn't take into account the number of cores on the physical server. You just need to look at the number of virtual cores being used by those virtual machines and license them with a minimum of 4. So again, very similar to in the physical world, and not really that different at all. So those are the 2 server and cal core licensing sort of entry-level licensing scenarios. There are a couple of other ones I want to look at just to help you be able to talk to your customers about some slightly more interesting scenarios. The first one is what we call enterprise core virtualization rights. So we've got our customer's server here, 2 processors, 4 cores in each one. So they license 8 core licenses, and this is of SQL Server Enterprise. They've got 8 cores, so they buy 8 licenses. And that allows them to run up to 8 virtual machines. The rule here being, if you license all the physical cores with SQL Server Enterprise, that gives the rights to 1 virtual machine per core license. So that's something only for Enterprise, not for Standard, and that can help customers be able to increase their virtual footprint. The next one is for customers who need even more, and this is unlimited virtualization. So we see here, server again, 2 processors, 4 cores in each one. So the customer here, they buy 8 core licenses, but with software assurance. And they can run unlimited SQL Server virtual machines. The rule being, you license all the physical cores with Enterprise Edition core licenses with software assurance, and you get unlimited virtualization rights. So the only thing there that you need to consider is the physical hardware. How many virtual machines of SQL can this physical hardware cope with? From a SQL licensing perspective, you can do unlimited VMs. So this one, if you're working with customers who are quite large, or have very heavy requirements for SQL Server and they want it in a virtual environment, looking at SQL Server Enterprise with SA, this can be a game changer in many ways. And as we go through the session, you'll see there are other benefits of software assurance, as well as the ones that you usually know about, new version rights and things. There are others as well. So it doesn't work in every scenario, of course, but for those customers who need heavy virtualization, Enterprise with SA, that can be the way to go, definitely. So again, we've got another true or false now. Server cal licensing cannot be used with virtual servers. Straight away, everyone there, yep, that's wrong. Server cal, we saw, you can absolutely use that with virtual machines. There's a minimum of 4 core licenses per. Again, don't even need to finish the question. Straight in there, absolutely. Finally, unlimited virtualization, only available for Enterprise Edition with SA. Yes, marvellous. This is very heartening to see. Thank you very much. Brilliant work, everyone. So now we move into another part of the licensing, which is slightly contradictory, perhaps it may first seem. So we said at the beginning that server cal only for standard. So why do I have a section about Enterprise Edition licensed server cal? So this is one of those fun bits of Microsoft licensing where you've got a rule, but there is sometimes a slight exception to that rule. This exists for those organizations who have had a long history with SQL Server. So in previous editions, Enterprise Edition was available through Server and Cal. So with SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2, you could buy Enterprise under Server Cal. And what Microsoft have done for organizations that had that edition with software assurance, when they upgraded to 2012 and there was no longer Enterprise Edition with Server and Cal, Microsoft said, for you, because you've bought it already and you've got software assurance, we will grandfather you through. You can still have your SQL Enterprise licensed through the Server Cal model. It's not available for new customers to purchase. You can't buy new Enterprise server licenses. So that's why we say it's not available, because for all intents and purposes it isn't. It's only around for those people who've had it since 2008. So just want to cover this partly so that you know that it does exist in certain cases. So if you go and talk to a customer and they say, oh yeah, I've got SQL Enterprise Edition 2016 Server Cal, you know how that's come about, that they've not gone crazy. It's because they've had it for years and they've kept upgrading through software assurance. And there are also some differences and some limitations that it's good to be aware of. So there are 2 editions of Enterprise Edition software. You've got the Server Cal version and you've got the core version. And there are slight technical limitations. So customers who have got it, they buy it, it's the core edition, no limitations from a technical perspective. For those customers who've got the Server Cal edition, where again, they've upgraded through the software assurance, that's limited to running on servers with 20 cores or less. So if you're talking to a customer, they've got Enterprise Edition Server Cal, they've been upgrading through the years, they've got 2016 edition, they want to put it on a server that's got 24 cores or 32 cores, whatever it may be, they wouldn't be compliant there because there is that limitation of maximum of 20 cores. So this is something, it's not going to come up every day, but it's good to know about it so that when it does, you can be the partner who says, actually, Mr. Customer, In this case, you need to look at something different, either reducing your number of cores or purchasing new licenses. Then from a virtualization perspective, for those customers with Enterprise Server Cal, they can have 4 virtual machines per server license, and again that maximum of 20 cores, this time across all the VMs. So as I say, not going to come up every day, but absolutely something to know about, something to have in your back pocket, so that if you're talking to a customer and this comes up, you can think to yourself, right, there are some differences. We need to look at this in a slightly different way to make sure that the customer remains compliant as we change their environment, or they change their hardware footprint. So don't worry about it too much, but just know that this does exist. And now we move to SQL Server license mobility. So this is a very important part of SQL Server licensing, and this is all around virtualization again. So first of all, we've got license mobility across server farms. And here we've got a physical server, 2 SQL VMs, and those SQL Server licenses, when it's within a server farm, so a server farm being where you have multiple servers that are connected together, those SQL licenses are effectively assigned to the server rather than the virtual machines themselves. So here we've got the virtual environment. One of the benefits of virtualization is the ability to move these virtual servers around as required. Could be one of those other servers has got more RAM available, so we'll move some of our SQL servers across to that one to make use of it. Could be that one of the servers goes down, so everything is dynamically moved around, as you can see there. So our 2 SQL VMs have ended up on that 3rd server. Brilliant, that's the point of virtualization, that's why I set this up. But you'll see now, those licenses are on the 1st server, and the virtual machines are on the 3rd server. So that doesn't look right, does it? We know if you've got something running on a server, you need a license on the server. So what you would need to do in this case, because those SQL VMs are now running on the 3rd server, you would need to buy 2 additional licenses so that that server is compliant. But in actual fact, those virtual machines, they could end up on that 2nd server as well. So you would need to buy 2 licenses for that server too, to make sure, should those VMs land on any of these servers, you will be in a compliant licensing position. So great, but now we've got 6 SQL Server licenses to run 2 SQL servers. Not particularly cost effective, I'm sure you will agree. So what we would do in this case, we would purchase instead those SQL Server licenses with software assurance. And one of the benefits of software assurance is license mobility. In this case, license mobility across server farms. And what this means is that for all intents and purposes, these licenses are now assigned to the VMs themselves. So as they move around the server farm, the licenses follow them too. So absolutely anyone that you're talking to from a customer perspective, and they're looking at putting SQL into a virtual environment and using VMware vMotion or Microsoft Hyper-V Live Migration or another tool that does the same thing of dynamically moving these virtual machines around the physical hardware, talk to them about software assurance. If they're already doing this and they don't have software assurance, it's likely that they will find themselves in a non-compliant licensing position. So, work with them to rectify that before it's too late. If they're starting a new environment, talk to them about software assurance, why it's required, and it's one of those conversations where you will typically find you need to include some of the tech guys so that you can really understand how their virtual environment is being built. Some of the business decision makers, so you can talk to them about the trade-offs between doing this from a technical perspective, what that means in terms of licensing. You might find customers who say, we're going to buy SQL 2016 and we're not going to upgrade for 10 years. We absolutely know this, so we're just going to blanket say no to software assurance. But from a technical perspective, it's required because they want to do this live migration. So it's absolutely a conversation. Anyone talking about virtualization, and even if they don't mention to you, oh yeah, we're going to virtualize SQL, if you're talking to a customer about any kind of virtualization, ask, are you planning on putting SQL Server in there? Or equally, if you're talking to a customer about SQL and they don't mention virtualization, ask the question, because it can radically change how the scenario is licensed, and in turn it can change the pricing, so it can become perhaps more expensive than they budgeted for. So make sure that they know that this SA requirement exists as soon as possible in the project plan. So that's license mobility across server farms. We've also got license mobility through software assurance. So here we've got that same server farm, got our 2 SQL VMs. The licenses have got software assurance on them. And we can see there one of the VMs moving around the server farm. Fantastic, that's what we would expect. But also, this other VM, it's gone outside, it's gone to the cloud. So this could be Microsoft Azure, or it could be a third-party service provider. This is another requirement for software assurance. If people want to start moving their SQL licensing into third-party data centers, they're going to need to look at software assurance. So when you're talking to customers about SQL, even if they're not thinking about moving things into the cloud immediately, it could be in 6 months, 12, 18 months they're going to start doing this. So they need to be looking at purchasing these SQL licenses with software assurance. If they want to move it into the Azure cloud or an authorized license mobility provider, they will need to have SA to have that right. And I think this is one of those things to absolutely talk to customers about as soon as possible. If you're doing an event with some of your customers, having a section about Microsoft licensing into the cloud, the requirements for it, that always goes down very well. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, talking to customers about software assurance and just educating them a little bit in how software assurance has changed over the years. Many customers do have this feeling of SA as being, it's just new version rights. So if I'm not going to be upgrading for 5+ years, I don't even need to think about SA. It's got no benefit to me. That's how customers may think. So sitting down, either on a one-to-one basis with the customer, or a customer webinar or an event, and just saying, look, let's look at software assurance as a concept now. How can it help you transform your business? If you want to start virtualizing, if you want to start moving things into the cloud, you need to think about software assurance very, very much as your friend. It enables so many of these new business transformation possibilities. So people who may previously have discounted SA, having that conversation, showing them the benefits, and the SA really is, a huge part of licensing these days, especially on the, that data center side for virtualization. So those are the 2 license mobilities across server farms and through SA. If there's any questions on those, please do let me know. But I think they're relatively straightforward. It's just thinking to yourself, in these scenarios, moving around a server farm or moving to the cloud, SA is going to be a requirement. So now we're going to look at some what we call further licensing principles, so things which are slightly more advanced perhaps than what we've seen already, and things that can help you spec up a scenario properly, make sure that you don't miss anything, but also things that give you the opportunity to have a slightly different conversation with the customer and offer them some advice and some expertise when it comes to SQL Server. So the first one is around high availability. So quite important with SQL Server because SQL Server as a database, it will be the central point for business data. So it could be for the CRM server or the ERP server or for the internal phone system. In general, if the SQL Server stops working, most other things will stop working. People won't be able to access customer data or add new records into SharePoint, this kind of thing. So having high availability in place, which mitigates some of these issues where if one server stops working, another one will take over, tend to be quite important when it comes to SQL. And it's also an area where things have changed over the years. So this is something with SQL Server where we've had SQL 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, 2012 R2, 2014, and now 2016. And through those additions, there have been some significant licensing changes over the years. So what you might find is a customer, they use a lot of SQL. Let's say they've got 2008 R2, which is still quite prevalent these days. So they've got 2008 R2. They went on a course. They did loads of research. They know all sorts of things about SQL licensing. They feel happy, brilliant. But things have changed over the years. So it's always worth making sure that you cover some of these points with customers, even if they say they don't need to, because it's likely that they may not have kept up to speed with the changes. And this is one of them. So high availability, where you've got active passive. So an active server, that's the one that's running, serving all the data. And then you've got a passive server which just sits there, just not doing anything, just taking copies of the data, waiting to come to life if needs be. So here, with that active server, you've got 12 cores. So you license it with 12 core licenses with software assurance. Then that passive server doesn't require any additional licensing. And this requirement for SA in some of these high availability areas is one of the things that's changed. So in previous editions, certain high availability scenarios were enabled just with the license, but now software assurance is required. So it's something, if a customer has got a SQL environment and they're just looking to upgrade to 2016, talk to them about high availability. How is it set up right now? Because it may well be that when they set it up with the edition they're currently using, they didn't need software assurance to do what they're doing. But with 2016, they might have to purchase SA in order to keep their environment the same. So you don't want people just upgrading like for like and then becoming non-compliant because they missed one of these licensing changes. So high availability, definitely something to talk to a customer about in that kind of scenario. So that's an active-passive scenario. If you've got active-active, where both servers are, as the name suggests, active, so they're both being accessed by clients, running reports, serving queries, serving data. In an active-active scenario, each server would need to be licensed fully. So the first active server, 12 core licenses, second active server, 12 core licenses. And in that case, you might choose not to buy software assurance because you don't need that passive SA benefit. But of course, as we've seen, so many other SA benefits with SQL that it will probably make sense anyway. But that's with high availability, talking to the customers, understanding their scenario. And again, it may be that the person you're talking to, if they're focused more on the business side, getting the right price, the purchasing, the right type of agreement, you may need to get them to bring in one of their SQL guys so that you, or perhaps one of your internal tech people, can fully understand how their SQL Server environment has been designed. And that ties in with the next one, which is about SQL Server components. So SQL Server, although it is sold as one entity, it does have different parts within it. So when it's all being run on one server, you just license that as you would expect. But here we can see some of the components. You've got SQL Server reporting services, and SQL Server analysis services. So these, all parts of SQL, but they do different things, and it can be the case that they require separate servers because of the way the customer has designed their environment. Reporting services, it could be that they use that very, very heavily, and it needs a standalone server with lots of power, lots of RAM, so that it doesn't slow down the other parts of SQL. And the same could be said for analysis services, where they're building data analysis cubes and doing some intensive work there. So it is possible to split these components out: database on one server, analysis server on another, reporting services on another, and that's fine. But if you do that, each server requires a full SQL Server license. And this again is something that you may find customers thinking about doing. And a customer will think, right, I've bought SQL, I can put the bits on different servers because that makes technical sense. But it's similar to Office licensing. You buy Office, you've got Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. You can't put Word on one machine, Excel on someone else's machine. It's a bundle, and they all go on one. The SQL Server, although you can put them on the other servers, you have to license them. So if you're using, in this example, we've got 3 servers that are running SQL components. The customer would need 3 SQL Server licenses. So again, when you're having those conversations with customers about how is your SQL environment designed, this is something to watch out for and to cover. So I think this is something I used to find when I was selling directly to customers, as you guys are. Customers will come and they will say, right, I want to buy X. I want to buy 3 copies of SQL Server standard. Brilliant. And there's perhaps the assumption where you think, well, the customer will have done their work and made sure that they're buying the right thing. But Microsoft licensing can be complex, and it's our position as partners to do those double checks and just say to the customer, can I check your high availability, your SQL components, your virtualization, and just tick those boxes and make sure that everything's in line. So almost having a checklist, so every time you talk to a customer about SQL Server, you make sure that you have got answers to these questions, because then and the customer knows that everything is licensed correctly, and that there are no nasty surprises for someone 2 years down the line. So I would say from today, reading through the data sheet that will be sent over next week when you're talking to Ingram, and there are plenty of SQL Server licensing guides out there that you can download and read to your heart's content. I would say do all that and come up with your checklist of things that you would always want to make sure have been covered. It makes things so much easier when you're doing SQL. So that's my bit of advice there, from someone who's been doing SQL for like 10, 11 years, something like that. The next thing to look at is software assurance upgrade rights. So we can see on the left customers having existing licenses with software assurance and what they can upgrade to. Nothing hugely surprising. standard server, you can upgrade to standard server, standard core to standard core. Those things are as one would expect, but the one to draw your attention to is the fourth one down. So customers who had SQL Server 2014 Business Intelligence Edition, which we've seen has been removed now. There is no Business Intelligence Edition. So those customers, they can upgrade to SQL Server Enterprise 2016. So if you're talking with customers and they've got BI, 2014 BI server with SA, and they're kind of saying, well, I want to upgrade, but I can't see a direct upgrade path. What do I do? Business Intelligence upgrades to Enterprise Server, and then you'll see that bottom one just showing that Enterprise Server 2014 upgrades to 2016, but the note at the bottom, as we've discussed, these Enterprise Server licenses aren't available for new customers to purchase. It's just for those customers with the existing software assurance grandfather rights. And as always, once we've spoken about the upgrade rights, it's time to talk about the downgrade rights and also down edition rights. So what we're seeing here is customers licensed for SQL Server Standard 2016, so they can choose to deploy earlier versions and lower editions. So they've got Standard 2016, they can deploy Standard 2014 or 2008, as you would expect. But Standard, they can also deploy Workgroup and Small Business Edition of SQL. Now, they weren't on the chart that we looked at earlier because, again, they no longer exist. So that's why the version is 2008 R2 or earlier, because that was the final time that they were available. But if a customer's got Standard 2016, they can deploy those if they need to. And then we'll see SQL Server Enterprise. With that one, you can deploy Standard or Enterprise or Business Intelligence or Workgroup or Small Business or Data Center. Data Center, again, an edition of SQL that used to exist, no longer does. And you can install those in the versions of when they were last available or earlier. So this, it's talking about Workgroup, Small Business, Data Center. This is quite a good slide just to show, again, how SQL has changed over the years. And SQL licensing, where it's per core now, it used to be per processor. So it's highly possible that you will go into a customer, and if they're using SQL Server 2008 or 2008 R2, their entire environment could be editions which no longer exist, that were licensed under licensing models which no longer exist. So, understanding what came before is useful for you, so that when you're talking to your customers and they talk about these things which no longer exist, you know that they're actually correct. They're just talking about older things. But it also means, when you're having a conversation with a customer, you may well need to prepare them for a number of changes. So, if they've got an older version of SQL and they're thinking, right, I want to go up to the new version, I've got 4 processors, so I'll need 4 processor licenses, and I want to have data center, you'll need to talk to them about the fact that actually you can't have data center, you'll probably need enterprise, but let's take some time, let's look at the features of standard, look at the features of enterprise, let's look at how you are utilizing your data center, which of these new additions matches up to the features that you need, and then where the customer's got 4 processors, now we need to look at the number of cores within those processors. Remember that 4-core minimum. So from a customer perspective, what can first seem like a very simple request, I just want to upgrade from this version to this version, can become a more in-depth conversation. And I think managing that with the customer and helping them understand why these things have changed over the last 8 to 9 years, very, very important. And it's, from a partner perspective, it's a fantastic time to work with them, find out more about their environment, understand how things have been done, how they want things to be done in the future, and really add some value, some advice to them as to how they can use different parts of the SQL licensing to really make the most of their environment. Talking about software assurance, moving to the cloud, virtualization, all these kinds of things. So a SQL upgrade conversation can be a very, very interesting time as a partner to really get to know your customer that bit better. So definitely with SQL, I would say don't shy away from the conversations, get stuck in, show your knowledge, and uncover as much information about your customer as you possibly can. The next thing to look at is step-ups. So this is a software assurance benefit, and this allows a customer to go from standard up to enterprise. So typically, without software assurance, if a customer buys standard and then 6-18 months later they want to do something and standard doesn't have those features, that's an enterprise feature, then they would have to purchase new enterprise licenses at full price and effectively write off that standard purchase. However, if you buy the standard licenses with software assurance, it gives you a step up from standard to enterprise, and that step up license costs the difference in price between the two editions. So if standard was, and these are made up numbers, standard was $100 and enterprise was $1,000, the step up would be $900. So the customer's not being, they're not being penalised for changing their mind, but it does mean they have to buy software assurance initially. So again, when you're talking with a customer, if they feel that their SQL usage is going to grow over time, we're starting off quite small now, but we think in the future we're going to be doing high-end analytics, mobile business intelligence, big data warehousing. It would be cost-effective in most cases to buy standard with SA now, so that you have that ability to step up later on in the agreement. So again, a conversation to have with a customer. But you'll see there, you can't step up between licensing models. So you can step up from standard core to enterprise core, but you can't go from standard server and cal to enterprise core. So again, a reason for customers to think about whether they want to go down the server cal or the core route. So now our final true or false. So first of all, components from one license can be installed on different servers with just that one license. Correct there, false. So although they can be installed technically from a licensing perspective, you can't do it with one license. You need one license per server. License mobility requires software assurance. True, absolutely. So whether that is license mobility across server farms or through software assurance, you need to have software assurance. And then finally, you can step up between the licensing models, so you can go from server cal to core. So, yep, seen some answers coming in. What have we got there? Yep, false. So you can step up between editions, so you can go from standard core to enterprise core, but you can't go from standard server cal to enterprise core. So that one is false. You can't go between the two licensing models. So that is SQL Server 2016. We've covered quite a lot of information there. If you're new to SQL before today, there's a lot of stuff there. And I think I would say even if you're pretty happy with SQL, on previous editions, previous versions, that again, there's a fair amount of information there. I would definitely recommend, if you're so inclined, going searching for the SQL Server 2016 licensing guides, having a read through them. You've got the holidays coming up, perfect time to read all about SQL Server, or at least having them, printed out in a drawer or saved on your desktop, so that when you get yourself into a SQL conversation, you've got that licensing guide there just to back you up, just so you can double check that you've remembered things from today correctly. So I hope that has been useful. Thank you very much for all the interaction. It's fantastic to see, and it does just feel good that people are interacting. So yeah, from me, thank you very, very much, and I will hand back now just to cover the final slide.
Thanks, Rich. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out the follow-up email to you by Monday, so you can access all the key information, including the 2-paging supporting PDF, recordings, and access to all the latest promotions. Plus, you'll also get access to the Licensing School blog. Whilst this is the final webinar in our current Licensing Live series, we are already in planning for next year. So stay tuned on the Microsoft Licensing webinar schedule, and finally I want to end by highlighting Ingram Micro's fantastic cloud team. If you are interested to learn more about building your cloud business with Ingram Micro, the Ingram Micro Cloud team is a great place to start. Take a look online or email the team or even give them a call. In the meantime, if you have any licensing questions, please email the team at licensinglive@ingrammicro.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and on behalf of Ingram Micro, Microsoft and the Licensing School, we wish you all very Merry Christmas and a very happy and prosperous New Year.